Hello! I hope to be taking care of a newborn by the time you guys are watching this, so thanks for bearing with me and watching a video of me talk here. We're going to be talking about how to take symptoms that a student is experiencing and translating those into academic accommodations. So we take the symptoms that the students are experiencing and then we make academic accommodations based on those symptoms. So the student reports the symptoms using a 1 to 6 or 1 to 10 scale. And we actually use both of those scales in the clinic because the impact test uses the 1 to 6 scale. However, we've found that the 1 to 10 scale works a little bit better, especially with our younger patients, just because they're more familiar with rating things on the 1 to 10 scale. So during the clinic, we are continually asking the patients to rate their symptoms on the scale. So as they're doing therapy tasks, then they will rate their symptoms before and after. These symptoms usually include headache, dizziness, mental fogginess, and disturbances in their vision. I strongly encourage schools to do the same thing by having the students rate their symptoms throughout the day, especially for the students who have really high symptoms and they're only attending an abbreviated schedule anyway. So let's look at the symptom log that I have the students use. This is what it looks like here. So it has a column for all the time, and they put like what their task was or what class they're attending. And then any additional notes. So these would be things like took a test or was on the computer for 20 minutes during that class, or those types of things, had a lab during science. They could also be things like if they're going to be going to Target, so they were at Target for 20 minutes with a lot of traffic on the way there, or something like that. And then here they are just rating their symptoms again: headache, dizziness, fogginess, and vision on that 1 to 10 point scale. When they get up in the morning, they need to rate their symptoms, and that acts as their baseline for their symptoms. A 2 to 3 point increase is considered a significant increase and would indicate to the student that they would need to take a break at that time. This is another example of a symptom log that some schools opt to use. It's a little bit simpler. The students just fill it out at the beginning of the day and then again at the end of the day. And then this is an example of a symptom log that we use with our younger patients. It's just a little bit more visual. So the symptom log helps the student to learn their own symptoms, and it also helps both myself and the patient to identify triggers of their symptoms. Some examples of very common triggers of symptoms are busy environments such as Target, Walmart, the mall. So for example, they go to Target with their parent, and after 15 minutes of shopping, they have to go back out to the car because they have an 8 out of 10 headache, increased dizziness. The parent has to finish shopping by themselves, and then they're closing their eyes on the entire ride home. So these symptoms tell me that visual stimulation of the busy environment, also increased auditory stimulation or increased noise, even just the walking around in the aisles with things kind of going by them in a close proximity is just too much for them, and it's triggering their symptoms. So these symptoms would indicate to me that school environments such as PE class, a sports game, watching a sports game going back and forth, especially like in basketball, show choir, passing periods, the lunchroom, these would all be environments that would also trigger symptoms for this student. The accommodations that those environments would translate into in the school setting would be delayed passing periods, eating lunch in an alternative setting with a few friends, avoiding extracurricular activities such as the sports games, and instead of watching PE, perhaps having a study hall instead. So going back to the alternative lunch setting with a few friends, a lot of times when I recommend this, schools are like, well, why do they need a few friends? And basically the main reason is so that these kids can stay social. We're taking away so much of their social time that then they get unplugged from their group of friends, and that does not help them recover. So I try really hard to find structured social times to work into the accommodations that I recommend for these kids. Headaches are another very common symptom that are reported in the post-concussive state. So how do we write accommodations for a headache? Well, and that's through scheduled breaks throughout the school day. A break can just be 10 to 15 minutes in a quiet environment to allow the brain to just idle and not have much stimulation or input during that time. So how do we know how often these students need the break? Well, that's where we turn back to the symptom checklist or the symptom log. And if by period 3 every day they have a headache of a 7 out of 10, then that tells us that they need to have a break after each period. Headaches of 3 to 4 on that scale can be managed by breaks. The goal is to catch the headache when it is at that 3 or 4 level to keep it from escalating too high. If they are already reporting a headache of a 6 or 7 or higher, then that's too high for them to use a break to bring that headache down, and they're likely going to be done for the rest of the day and they'll need to go home. So some schools use the symptom logs as the students pass for the whole day. So they use it for their pass for the delayed passing periods, or their pass to the nurse's office to take those scheduled breaks. Others just opt to do the more simple symptom checklists like I showed you earlier, where they're just rating their symptoms at the beginning of the day and then at the end of the day. The important thing is that the patient or the student is actually filling out those symptom logs on a daily basis. Otherwise, they don't really do us much good. The other important piece of those symptom logs is that they need to be revisited and analyzed with either the concussion management team member or counselor, the nurse who's ever kind of managing the concussion for that patient, and the patient. After a couple days, the logs can be reviewed and analyzed by the concussion management team member and the student to determine if the accommodations that they currently have in place are still necessary. If the student is attending just half day of a school and by the time they leave, their symptoms are at a 3 or a 4, that's a really good indication that they're ready to increase their school day. They can manage those 3 to 4 level symptoms with additional accommodations such as the scheduled breaks. Likely, as the student continues in their recovery process and gets better, they're going to need less accommodations. However, if they were at half a day, they may not have needed scheduled breaks. But as soon as they increase their school day to a full day, their symptoms may increase and they may need those scheduled breaks to help. Another topic that we get a lot of questions about are tests. So what are we going to do about tests? Students that have missed a lot of school obviously fall behind quickly on their tests and quizzes. That's no big surprise. While I do not recommend taking standardized tests during their recovery period, I do think that students should take the tests or quizzes for the classes that they are currently attending. They just may need accommodations for those tests. So those accommodations may be double time on the test, taking the test in an alternative environment where they can have decreased distractions. They could take a break in the middle of the test. They can talk out loud to themselves during the test. All of these things will allow them to be able to keep up on some of the tests and quizzes and not fall so far behind. Because then what happens is they are then asked to take a test 4 weeks after they've gone over the material when it's no longer fresh in their head, and that just causes increased stress for that student and doesn't help them recover. So after the student has taken the test, the concussion management team member can objectively see if that student was ready to take the test and if those accommodations were successful for that student. It's always a trial and error process for all of these accommodations. It's the same thing with increasing school days. If you increase your school days to full and it's too much, then you back it off and you try to only increase those school days 2 to 3 times a week. This is why continually revisiting the symptom logs is so crucial to making sure that the return to learn process is going smoothly for that patient. Certain classes may increase symptoms due to lighting, instruction style, more screen time required for that certain class, or more notes or reading required for that class, which increases their strain on eyes. Again, this is where those symptom logs are going to show us that every 5th period in language arts, for instance, that this student is having these increased symptoms, but for the rest of the day, they're able to manage their symptoms at a 3 or 4 level. So then you can really identify what those triggers are in that certain class. Whereas if you didn't have that log, then, you know, they get to a 5 or 7 headache by period 5, and we're kind of like, well, why is this happening? And it's hard to go back on a day-to-day basis and kind of, you know, put all those pieces to the puzzle together. So that's where these symptom logs are just so helpful in making sure that the patient is getting the appropriate accommodations during their return to learn process. The symptom logs that I showed you earlier will all be available to you for you to use as a resource going forward from today. Thank you.